I vividly remember the day William and I brought our twin boys, Mason and David, home from the hospital. We were exhausted, but our hearts were bursting with joy at the beginning of our new life as a family. Just as we crossed the threshold of our modest apartment, the phone rang. It was my mother-in-law, Sandra, on the other end of the line. Without even a proper greeting, my mother-in-law announced she was coming over. I didn't even have time to protest before she hung up. I looked at William desperately, telling him we had just gotten home and needed rest. I had hoped he would intervene, but he just shrugged his shoulders with a helpless look that said there was nothing he could do. 30 minutes later, Sandra stormed into our apartment like a hurricane. She didn't even bother to ring the doorbell, using her own key that we didn't even know she had. She burst in demanding to know where her grandchildren were, completely ignoring our shocked and tired expressions. She went straight to the nursery, though we had barely had time to prepare the room. I followed her, my stomach churning with a mixture of irritation and anxiety. She wrinkled her nose and exclaimed in dismay about the smell. She demanded to know why the windows weren't open, insisting babies needed fresh air. Before I could respond, she was already throwing open both the curtains and windows. She didn't care that it was the middle of winter or that the pediatrician had advised us to maintain a constant temperature for the newborns. I tried to intervene by saying her name and mentioning what the pediatrician had told us. She cut me off with contempt in her voice when I mentioned the pediatrician. She boasted about raising 3 children without needing pediatricians, claiming people in her day just knew what was best for children without being told. She would appear without warning at any time of day, always armed with new criticisms and unsolicited advice. One day, as I was trying to nurse David, she barged into the room without knocking. She asked in an accusatory tone if I was still breastfeeding. She lectured that in her day, babies this age were already eating porridge, insisting my baby was too skinny and needed more nutrition. When I tried to calmly explain that the doctor said breast milk alone was sufficient for 6 months, she scoffed. She told me what I needed was to listen to experienced voices, promising to bring William's old porridge recipe the next day, assuring me the baby would gain weight quickly. Every day brought a new battle. If it wasn't about nursing, it was about the clothes, room temperature, or how to hold the babies. Nothing seemed right to her. One afternoon, as I was changing Mason's diaper, she walked in unannounced as usual. She dramatically held her nose and exclaimed about the smell. I tried to maintain my patience, explaining that I was in the middle of changing a diaper. She pushed me aside, declaring I was doing it wrong and insisting she would take over. I stood there in silence, watching her change Mason's diaper, feeling a mixture of frustration and helplessness welling up inside me. When she finished, she looked at me with a smug expression, telling me that was how it should be done and that I needed to pay more attention. That night, when William returned from work, I couldn't contain my emotions anymore. Through tears, I told him his mother was driving me crazy and that nothing I did was right, making me feel like a failure as a mother. William hugged me, but I could feel his discomfort. He weakly reminded me that I knew what his mother was like, insisting she only wanted what was best for the children. I asked him what was best for me, what was best for our family. I told him we needed space, needed to raise our children our own way. He nodded, but I could see in his eyes he had no intention of confronting his mother. I felt more alone than ever before. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and her constant presence became suffocating. Even intimate moments with the children felt like they were under her surveillance. One morning, as I was preparing the twins' bath, I heard the door open. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and braced myself for another round of criticism. She walked into the bathroom uninvited, greeting me as she entered. She questioned my choice of regular soap, lecturing me about baby's delicate skin and insisting I should use oatmeal soap. I felt my patience reaching its limit as I started to speak her name, trying to thank her for her concern while mentioning the pediatrician. She cut me off at the mention of the pediatrician, declaring I knew nothing about raising children and that these poor angels would be neglected without her. I felt something break inside me. Tears started flowing, but this time they weren't from sadness, they were from pure frustration. I begged her to please give us some space, reminding her these were my children and I was doing my very best. She stared at me, as if I had slapped her. She demanded to know if I thought I knew better than her, declaring that without her these children would have no one who truly cared about them. Her words hit me like a physical blow, the audacity of her implying that I didn't care about my own children stunning me. Before I could respond, she stormed out of the bathroom, muttering something about ungrateful modern daughters-in-law. That night, after putting the twins to bed, I sat in the rocking chair in their room, watching their peaceful sleeping faces. They were so tiny and innocent, deserving to grow up in an environment of love and peace, not constant tension. I knew then that I had to make a change, for the sake of my children and my own mental health. We needed to establish boundaries. I struggled with how to do this without destroying family bonds, how to make her understand that her well-intentioned help was doing more harm than good. As I pondered these questions, I heard William returning from work. I knew I needed his support to face this situation, that we needed to have a serious discussion. With a heavy sigh, I rose from the rocking chair, taking one last look at my sleeping babies. I steeled myself for what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation. As I quietly closed the door behind me, I strengthened my resolve that something had to change. Little did I know then that the events of the next few days would test my patience and family relationships in ways I could never have imagined. Time flew by, and suddenly we were just 2 days away from Mason and David's first birthday. Despite the constant challenges with Sandra, I was excited to celebrate this important milestone in my children's lives. I had planned a small party, nothing extravagant, just close family and a few friends. The night before, I stayed up late finishing the preparations. I hung balloons, streamers, and a small banner reading "Happy First Birthday Mason and David." Though exhausted, I felt satisfied imagining my children's smiles when they saw the decorations. But the peace didn't last long. At exactly 7 a.m., persistent knocking on the door jolted me awake. I jumped up, my head fuzzy and my heart racing. William had already left for work, leaving me alone with the twins. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with Sandra Smith. Before I could process her unexpected early arrival, she stormed into our apartment without even a greeting. Her eyes scanned every corner of the room, finally settling on the decorations I had prepared the night before. She pointed at the balloons and flower garlands with contempt, demanding to know what all this was. I felt my inner irritation rising as I explained these were for the children's birthday party that she knew was in 2 days. She dismissed my explanation with a contemptuous wave of her hand, saying that wasn't important right now. She pointed at the floor, claiming it was filthy and questioning how I could even think of having a party in such conditions. I looked at the floor in confusion, noting only the usual crumbs and dust that came with having 1-year-old twins. I tried to maintain my composure as I addressed her, thanking her for her concern but assuring her I had everything under control and would clean thoroughly the day before the party. She raised her voice at the mention of tomorrow, insisting this couldn't wait. She lectured that guests would be horrified by this state, saying it reflected poorly on me as both a mother and a housewife. I felt my blood beginning to boil at being judged this way. Before I could respond, the twins' crying echoed from their room, awakened by our argument. I turned to go check on them, telling her I needed to see to the children. But she followed me, saying in an unrelenting voice that I should let them cry as it was good for their lungs, and cleaning the floor was more important right now. I stopped in my tracks and turned to face her, telling her as politely as I could that my children came first and the floor could wait. I entered the twins' room, hearing my mother-in-law's disapproving sighs behind me, as I found Mason and David standing in their crib with tear-stained red faces. I lifted them both into my arms, trying to comfort them. I whispered soothingly as I gently rocked them, telling them Mama was here. She appeared in the doorway with her arms crossed. She declared I was spoiling them, stating that in her day, babies learn to settle themselves. I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my mind. I told her that every mother has her own way of parenting, and this was mine. I carried the twins out of the room and headed to the kitchen, needing to prepare their bottles and honestly, craving a moment away from her. But she followed me like a relentless shadow. As I warmed the milk, she continued her lecture. She said she couldn't understand how I could be so careless, complaining about the messy house, crying children, and my unkempt hair, wondering what her William would think if he saw me like this. I felt anger building inside me. I wondered if she could see how much I did every day, if she understood how exhausting it was caring for twins around the clock. I tried to maintain a respectful tone as I addressed her, assuring her I understood her concerns, but everything was under control. I promised the house would be perfect for the party and the children were well cared for. But she wasn't listening. She continued talking about how women in her day kept perfect homes and raised children without complaints. Each word felt like a wound to my self-esteem. When the milk was ready, I sat on the sofa to feed the twins. She stood in front of me, with her hands on her hips. She said in an accusing voice that she couldn't believe I would sit down to nurse with the floor in such condition, calling me lazy and incompetent. Something broke inside me at that moment. Months of accumulated frustration exploded. I shouted for her to stop, surprising even myself with the volume of my voice. The twins startled and began crying again. I told her firmly that she wasn't me, this was my home, these were my children, and I would decide how to raise them. Her face turned red with anger. She demanded to know how I dared speak to her that way, reminding me she was the children's grandmother. Fighting to stay calm, I acknowledged she was their grandmother but emphasized that I was their mother. I thanked her for her concern but insisted she needed to respect my decisions. She stared at me, as if I had slapped her. For a moment I thought she might leave, but instead she did something unexpected. In a quick motion, she snatched the bottle from my hands. She shouted that if I couldn't properly care for her grandchildren, she would do it herself. The twins, frightened by the sudden movement and the tension in the room, began crying even louder. I tried to grab the bottle back, but she backed away, clutching it like a trophy. I stood up with the twins in my arms and shouted at her to give it back. I desperately told her that the babies were frightened and hungry. But she refused to listen as she paced around the room, waving the bottle and screaming that I was an incompetent mother. The twins cried louder and louder, and I felt control of the situation slipping away from me. That's when I noticed the twin stroller in the corner of the room. Just as I was about to suggest going for a walk to change the atmosphere, she did something so shocking I still can't believe it today. She grabbed the stroller and threw it against the wall with all her might. The crash was deafening, making my ears ring. The twins screamed in terror while I stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. The stroller, a precious gift from my parents, lay broken against the wall, one wheel spinning uselessly. Her face contorted with rage as she screamed that this is what happens when you don't respect your elders. In that moment, something changed inside me. Months of fear and anxiety transformed into steely resolve. My children needed protection, and I was the only one who could provide it. She stared at me in disbelief when I spoke. "What?" she exclaimed, her eyes widening. With a stronger voice, I repeated that she needed to leave my home. I told her I wouldn't allow her to frighten my children or destroy our belongings anymore. For a moment, she seemed about to protest, but something in my eyes must have shown her I meant every word. Without another word, she turned toward the door. I thought the nightmare was over, but I was wrong. Before leaving, she turned back and fixed me with a venomous stare. She spat out that I would regret this. Then, in one final act of malice, she left the apartment, taking the outside key that couldn't be unlocked from inside, and slammed the door shut. The sound of the lock clicking into place echoed in my ears like a sentence. There we were, trapped in the room with my trembling twins, a broken stroller, no bottle, and no way out. I collapsed onto the sofa, holding Mason and David tight against me. I tried to calm them as tears of frustration and fear rolled down my cheeks. How had it come to this? How had a simple visit turned into such a nightmare? Looking at the clock, I saw it was only 8:30 in the morning. William wouldn't be home from work until the late afternoon. We were trapped with no way to prepare food for the babies and no way to call for help. My phone was in the bedroom, out of reach. As I desperately tried to soothe my crying twins, my mind was racing. I knew I had to find a solution. I knew I had to protect my children and end this situation once and for all. Little did I know then that this terrifying incident would become a turning point in our lives. At that moment, all I could do was hold my babies and pray that someone would come to help us. The sound of the door slamming was still ringing in my ears. The twins were crying inconsolably in my arms, frightened by the noise and the tense atmosphere in the room. I felt trapped, not just physically in the apartment, but emotionally, as if I had completely lost control of the situation. I whispered softly while gently rocking them, telling them everything would be all right and that my precious little ones were safe. Yet even as I spoke those words, I questioned whether things really would be okay. I looked around the room, trying to assess the situation. The broken stroller lay by the wall, a cruel testament to her anger. The carefully prepared bottle was nowhere to be found, presumably thrown away somewhere in her rage. Mason and David were still crying, and I could feel their tiny bodies trembling against my chest. They were hungry and needed to be calmed down. I knew I had to think of a solution. I carefully stood up from the sofa and made my way to the kitchen with the babies in my arms. Opening the refrigerator was a struggle, but I managed to support the twins with one arm while retrieving the milk bottle with my other hand. The challenge was figuring out how to warm and prepare it without having both hands free. I kissed my little treasures on their heads and told them we would try something. I carefully placed them in their high chairs. Their cries immediately grew louder as they reached out to me with their tiny arms. I murmured that I understood and promised I would be right back. I quickly poured milk into a new bottle and started warming it. While waiting, I searched the room for my cell phone but couldn't find it. I must have left it in the bedroom when I rushed to get up that morning. The microwave's buzzer brought me back to reality. I checked the milk's temperature on my wrist and, satisfied, returned to the twins. At the sight of the bottle, their crying softened, and they eagerly began to drink. As I fed them, my mind wouldn't stop racing with thoughts. How had it come to this? I wondered how our family relationships had deteriorated so badly. I remembered every moment I had tried to set boundaries with Sandra Smith, every time I had sought William's support. How had we failed to see that things could become this extreme? After the twins finished eating, I gently rocked them until they fell asleep, exhausted from the morning's stress. I carefully carried them to their room and laid them in their beds. For a while, I watched them sleep, touched by their innocence and vulnerability. That's when I spotted my phone on the nightstand. I grabbed it frantically, hoping to call someone, anyone, for help. But my heart sank when I saw the black screen. The battery was dead. Back in the living room, I was overwhelmed by a mixture of frustration and despair. The wall clock showed it was still only 10 a.m. William wouldn't be home until 6 p.m. I wondered how I would get through these hours of being trapped. I approached the door and examined it, but there was little hope of finding a way to open it. The lock was solid, and I had no tools to break it. For the next hour, I tried to distract myself by cleaning up the chaos she had left behind. As I gathered the pieces of the broken stroller, my heart ached thinking about this ruined gift from my parents. While cleaning, I couldn't help wondering how I would explain this to William. Would he believe me? Would he understand the gravity of the situation with his mother? The twins' cries interrupted my thoughts. They had woken from their nap, probably hungry again. I sighed and prepared myself for another round. As I tended to Mason and David, changing diapers and feeding them, an idea began forming in my mind. Perhaps this was some kind of opportunity. A chance to prove once and for all that her accusations of me being an incompetent mother were unfounded. A chance to show that I could care for my children even in the most challenging circumstances. With renewed determination, I decided to make this trap day as meaningful and enjoyable as possible. I took out toys and books and began improvising games with the twins. I sang songs, told stories, and delighted in their laughter and babbling. As time passed, I found an unexpected peace in this chaos. Though we were trapped and the situation was both absurd and potentially dangerous, I was able to spend uninterrupted time with my children without her constant criticism and interference. As dinner time approached, however, my anxiety began to build again. The baby food was running low, and I hadn't eaten anything all day. I watched the clock, counting every minute until William would return home. Finally, around 6:30 p.m., I heard the sound of keys. My heart leaped. Was it William, or had his mother returned? The door opened, and there stood William with a confused expression. He asked why the outside lock was engaged as he entered the apartment. His expression changed to concern when he saw my pale, exhausted face and the twins clinging to me. He asked what had happened. The words poured out like a flood. I told him everything about his mother's early morning visit, the criticism, the fight, the destroyed stroller, and being locked in. As I spoke, the tears I had held back all day began to flow. William listened in silence. His expression changed from disbelief to horror to anger. When I finished, he embraced me and the twins. He whispered that he was so sorry, that he hadn't known his mother would go this far. I looked into his eyes and told him we couldn't go on like this. I explained that his mother needed help and we needed to set clear boundaries to prevent this from ever happening again. He nodded slowly. He agreed, saying he should have listened to me sooner and promising he would fix this. That night, after putting the twins to bed, William and I had a long talk. We discussed how his mother's constant interference had affected our family life and my mental health since the children were born. For the first time, I felt William truly understood the gravity of the situation. He said we would change the locks first thing tomorrow and he would talk to his mother, ensuring this would never happen again. I nodded, feeling immense relief. Yet somewhere in my heart, I was still worried. Would one conversation be enough? Would she understand the need to respect our boundaries? As I prepared for bed, exhausted from the long day, I couldn't help wondering what the future would bring. What would happen with the twins' birthday party? How would we handle our relationship with her going forward? Little did I know then that the next day would bring a discovery that would change everything. I would discover tools that would help me confront her once and for all. I closed my eyes as I lay next to William. I prayed that the next day would bring the peace and harmony our family so desperately needed. But I had no idea then that fate had other plans in store. The next morning dawned with an uneasy quietness. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, gently illuminating the room. As I slowly woke up, I almost forgot the events of the previous day for a moment. But hearing William's soft snoring beside me brought reality rushing back. It was an unusual sight for a weekday. I sat up in bed and rubbed my eyes. William had taken the day off to take care of things. He needed to replace the locks and, most importantly, talk to his mother. Anxiety gripped me when I thought about that conversation. How would she react? Would she understand the need to respect our boundaries? The twins' cries interrupted my thoughts. I quickly got up, leaving William sleeping, and headed to the nursery. Mason and David were in bed, their faces red from crying. I gently lifted them into my arms, softly greeting my precious little ones. I told them it was the start of a new day. As I changed their diapers and fed them, I couldn't help wondering how recent events would affect their first birthday. The party was planned for the next day, and though it was meant to be small, I feared the family tension would spoil the celebratory atmosphere. William joined me in the kitchen a little later, his expression serious but determined. He told me, while pouring coffee, that he had called the locksmith. They would come to replace the locks in the afternoon. I nodded gratefully at his proactive response. I carefully asked if he had spoken with his mother. William let out a deep sigh. He said not yet, explaining that he wanted to talk to her in person after the locksmith was finished. The thought of William confronting his mother alone worried me. I knew how much influence she had over him and how she could manipulate his emotions with carefully chosen words. I suggested that I should go with him. William looked at me with surprise and asked if I would be all right going with him after what happened the previous day. I answered firmly that it was precisely because of the previous day's events that I needed to go. I told him we needed to present a united front and that she needed to hear my side of the story directly. William nodded slowly, giving me a small grateful smile, and agreed that we should do this together. The rest of that morning passed in a tense silence. We tended to the twins, cleaned the house, and made final preparations for the next day's party. But the looming confrontation with her hung over us, like a heavy weight. Around noon, while William was playing with the twins in the living room, I decided to put up party decorations. As I climbed on a chair to hang some flowers, something caught my eye. There, in the corner of the ceiling, almost hidden by a hanging plant, was a small security camera. My heart skipped a beat. I called out to William in disbelief, asking him to come over. William entered the room carrying Mason in his arms and asked what was wrong. I pointed to the camera and asked what it was. William followed my gaze, and his expression changed, guilt and shame crossing his face. He confessed that he had installed it last week. I stepped down from the chair, feeling a mix of confusion and anger. I demanded to know why he had installed cameras without telling me. William put Mason down on the floor and came closer to me. He apologized and admitted he should have told me, explaining that things had been disappearing from the house lately. He said they were small, insignificant items, but it was puzzling, and he had wondered if there was an issue with the cleaning service. At that moment, a realization struck me like lightning. The missing items always disappeared after his mother's visits. I had noticed things being moved around but never imagined. In a whisper, I asked if he suspected his mother. William nodded slowly. He told me he hadn't wanted to believe it, but he had suspected his mother and installed the camera because he needed proof before accusing her. I sank onto the sofa, trying to process this new information. On one hand, I felt betrayed that William had installed cameras without telling me. Yet on the other hand, I felt a small sense of relief, thinking this could be the evidence we needed. I slowly said William's name and asked if the camera had been recording the previous day. His eyes widened as he understood the meaning of my question. Without a word, he went to the bedroom and returned with his laptop. He sat next to me and began searching through files. He found the video from the morning the day before and opened it. Our hearts pounding, we watched the footage unfold on the screen. Everything was captured in high definition: her early morning arrival, our argument, and her rage. When we reached the part where she threw the stroller against the wall, William audibly gasped. He whispered in a voice full of pain and disappointment that he couldn't believe what he was seeing. We silently continued watching until the scene where she left with the key. William stopped the video and stared at the blank screen, seemingly unable to process what he had just watched. Finally turning to me, he apologized profusely, saying he should have believed me from the start and set boundaries long ago. I took his hand, feeling a mix of emotions as I told him it wasn't his fault and that his mother needed help. We fell into silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, William spoke up, asking what we should do next. It was a complicated question. We had definitive evidence of her unacceptable behavior, yet she was still William's mother and our children's grandmother. We couldn't simply cut all ties. I slowly suggested that we needed to show her the video. I explained that she needed to see her own actions with her own eyes, hoping it might help her understand the gravity of the situation. William nodded, but I could see the pain in his eyes. He agreed, but worried about what would happen if she didn't understand, if this only made things worse. It was a valid concern. Knowing her, she might react defensively and accuse us of conspiring against her. But I knew we couldn't let things continue as they were. I told him we had to take the risk, for our family and for the twins, as we couldn't let this continue any longer. William held me tightly, and I could feel his body trembling slightly. He whispered that we would do this together. The rest of the afternoon flew by. The locksmith came to change the locks, giving us a sense of security we hadn't felt in a long time. We packed the twins' diaper bag with snacks and supplies as if preparing for a regular outing. Her house was only 20 minutes away. As I helped the children into the car, I felt a new sense of determination wash over me. I was no longer the anxious daughter-in-law who feared her mother-in-law's visits. I was a mother protecting her family, and a wife standing strong with her husband through difficult times. The drive to her house was quiet. William kept his eyes fixed on the road, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. I looked out the window, turning over in my mind what to say and how to handle the situation. When we arrived, William turned off the engine, but didn't move to get out. He turned to me, with a mix of determination and fear in his eyes. He asked if I was ready. I nodded, taking his hand. I assured him we were doing the right thing. In a way, I felt we were heading into battle. When William rang the doorbell, we could hear her footsteps approaching. During those moments as the door opened, we exchanged one last look. We both knew that regardless of how this confrontation ended, nothing would ever be the same. The door opened, and she appeared. Her expression changed from surprise to contempt in an instant. She said in a sarcastic voice that she was surprised we had decided to visit her. William stepped forward. William called out to his mother respectfully but firmly, saying they needed to talk. As we entered the house, I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew what was about to happen would forever change our family dynamics. I could only hope it would be for the better. The next morning dawned with complicated emotions. It should have been a day of pure joy, Mason and David's first birthday. The previous night's confrontation with her had been tense and exhausting. Though we had shown her the video, her reaction had been complex. As I prepared the twins' breakfast, I couldn't help but remember the scene. I watched her face change from indignation to disbelief, and finally to anger mixed with shame. When she saw her own actions on screen, she made excuses and refused to take responsibility, even accusing us of manipulating the video. It was especially painful for William to see his mother like that. I was lost in these thoughts when William's good morning greeting interrupted my reverie. He came into the kitchen looking exhausted. He asked about our birthday boys. I handed him coffee and told him they were still sleeping. I asked if he was okay. William let out a deep sigh. He admitted he wasn't sure and part of him wanted to cancel the party. I finished his thought, reminding him that they were his children. I told him they deserved to celebrate their birthday, regardless of the issues with his mother. He nodded while taking a sip of coffee. He agreed we couldn't let this ruin their special day. We decorated the apartment, blew up balloons, and prepared snacks. The twins, oblivious to adult tensions, laughed and played with the balloons. Watching them so happy and innocent reminded us why we were doing all this. It was for them, for their happiness and safety. As party time approached, anxiety began to build in my stomach. We had invited a small group of family and close friends. Among them was Aunt Judith, a highly respected family member. Despite everything that had happened, we had also invited Sandra because William insisted she was still the children's grandmother. The guests began arriving shortly after noon. Aunt Judith was among the first to arrive, bringing along Father Michael, the local priest, whom she had invited without consulting us. Any other time, I might have been irritated by this unexpected addition, but today, strangely enough, his presence gave me an odd sense of comfort. Aunt Judith hugged us enthusiastically, exclaiming birthday wishes for our little angels. Father Michael greeted us with a gentle smile and blessed the twins. As the guests settled in the living room, my eyes kept darting to the door with a mixture of anxiety and concern, waiting for Sandra's arrival. William must have noticed my unease because he gently squeezed my shoulder. He whispered that everything would be fine and that we were in this together. Finally, about an hour into the party, she appeared. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Conversations stopped, and all eyes turned to her. She announced her apology for being late in a haughty voice, claiming there had been heavy traffic. William and I exchanged glances. We both knew her house was only 20 minutes away. The party continued, but there was a palpable tension in the air. She moved around the room, speaking in hushed tones with the guests. Occasionally, fragments of her conversations would reach my ears, making my heart sink further. I heard her saying how clueless we were about raising children and how she wondered what would happen without her presence. I tried to focus on celebrating the twins' first year of life, but her words kept echoing in my ears, poisoning what should have been a happy day. Things came to a head during lunch. As everyone was gathered around the table enjoying their meal, Sandra began her speech. She started in a voice dripping with false sweetness, addressing the dear family, and announcing that before cutting the cake, she wanted to say a few words about her beloved grandchildren and their special upbringing. I felt William tense beside me. Everyone at the table waited quietly with expressions mixing curiosity and unease. She continued, saying that as everyone knew, she had been deeply involved in Mason and David's lives since their birth, and it had been challenging. She paused dramatically, scanning the table before fixing her eyes on me. She claimed there had been moments when she worried about her grandchildren's happiness and times when she had to intervene to ensure proper care. My heart was pounding. I couldn't believe she was really going to do this. Was she really going to tell such blatant lies in front of the entire family? She continued, her voice trembling with fake emotion as she brought up yesterday. She claimed she had to rescue her poor grandchildren from neglect, saying the house was in a terrible state and the children were crying and abandoned, and she could not bear it any longer. I suddenly stood up. My chair scraped against the floor. All eyes turned to me. Though my voice trembled, I spoke firmly, telling her that was not the truth and that I had proof. Gasps of surprise rose from around the table. She looked at me with a mixture of shock and contempt. She demanded to know how I dared to contradict her. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. Without saying a word, I took my phone from my pocket and walked toward the living room smart TV. Her voice began to waver as she asked what I was planning to do. Ignoring her, I connected my phone to the TV. My hands trembled slightly as I searched for the video William had transferred to my device the night before. I turned to face the family and apologized, explaining that they needed to know the truth. With that, I pressed play. As the video began, a deafening silence fell over the room. I watched as the guests' expressions changed from confusion to shock and then to horror as the footage played. The video showed Sandra forcing her way into our apartment uninvited. It showed her shouting and criticizing. It showed her snatching a bottle from the baby. And finally, it showed her throwing the stroller against the wall in a fit of rage before leaving us locked inside. When the video ended, the silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. All eyes turned to her, whose face had drained of color. She stammered, desperately looking around the room for allies but finding none. Aunt Judith was the first to break the silence. Her voice shaking with outrage, she asked Sandra how she could do such things. Father Michael added his own words, his face showing deep disappointment. Father Michael spoke gravely, telling Sandra that what we had witnessed was deeply serious, not just the lies, but putting her grandchildren in danger. The guests began to raise their voices in shock and condemnation. Backed into a corner, Sandra began making desperate accusations. She screamed that the video had been edited and that this was all a conspiracy against her. But no one believed her anymore. The evidence was too clear and convincing. William, who had been silent all this time, finally stood up. Though his face was pale, his voice was firm. He told his mother that this had to stop, that he couldn't allow her to keep hurting his family. He said she needed help, and until she got it, she wouldn't be allowed near his children. William's words seemed to be the final blow for Sandra. Without another word, she stood up from the table and ran from the house, leaving behind a stunned silence. After she left, there was a moment of complete stillness. Then gradually, people began to approach us with words of support and comfort. Aunt Judith hugged us with tears in her eyes, apologizing and saying she should have noticed sooner and believed us earlier. Father Michael approached with a solemn expression. He said we had done the right thing by revealing the truth, and suggested we should now pray for Sandra to find her path to redemption. As the party continued with a completely different atmosphere, I sat on the sofa, exhausted but relieved. William sat next to me, and took my hand, simply saying thank you. No more words were needed. I understood how difficult it had been for him, how painful it was to confront his own mother. But I also knew it had been necessary for our family. Watching Mason and David playing happily on the floor, oblivious to what had just happened, I felt a surge of love and protectiveness. We had done the right thing. We had protected our family. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. I knew there would be consequences. Things with Sandra would never be the same. But for the first time in a long while, I felt hope. Hope that we could now raise our children in peace, without constant interference and control. As the afternoon wore on and guests began to leave one by one, I reflected on the day's events. It had become an unforgettable first birthday, though not for the reasons we had expected. Looking at our children and my husband, I realized this day might mark not just the first year of Mason and David's life, but the beginning of a new chapter for our family. A chapter of honesty, healthy boundaries, and unconditional love. With that thought, I joined William and the twins, determined to end this day celebrating what truly mattered, our family and our love for each other.